In 1960, the city of Greenville, South Carolina, built a 4-lane highway bridge directly on top of a 40-foot waterfall. Not next to it, not around it, on top of it. The Camperdown Way Bridge sat so low and so wide that it cast the falls into permanent shadow. Within a few years, most residents of Greenville had forgotten the waterfall was there at all. That bridge stood for 42 years, and underneath it, the neighborhood went to ruin. Drugs, prostitution, derelict warehouses, a stretch of the Reedy River so fouled by textile dye that the water ran a different color every day depending on which mill was dumping upstream. The city had paved over its own origin story. And it would take a Holocaust refugee, a garden club, and a $34 million performing arts center before anyone would think to look under the concrete. That waterfall is where this story begins, because it is where everything in Greenville begins. In 1768, an Irish trader named Richard Paris paddled up the Reedy River, saw the falls, and decided this was the place. He built a grist mill at the base, married a Cherokee woman, and received roughly 100,000 acres from her tribe. The mountain that overlooks the city still carries a version of his name, Paris Mountain. Paris sided with the British during the Revolution and lost everything. The new state of South Carolina claimed the Cherokee territory, carved it into bounty grants for patriot soldiers, and in 1786 established Greenville County, named probably for General Nathaniel Greene, hero of the Southern campaign, though some say it was simply a description of what the land looked like. A speculator named Lemuel Alston bought the old Paris acreage, amassed more than 11,000 acres around the Reedy, and in 1797 platted 60 lots for a village he called Pleasantburg. The courthouse went up first, a log building planted in the middle of the only road. And for the next 2 decades, that's about all there was: a courthouse, a road, and a waterfall. Then Vardry McBee arrived. McBee was a saddle maker and merchant from North Carolina, who in 1815 purchased Alston's entire 11,000-acre holding for $27,500. That price, roughly $2.50 an acre for what is now the center of a metropolitan area approaching 600,000 people, turned out to be the most consequential real estate transaction in the history of the Carolina Piedmont. McBee didn't just buy land. He bought a theory about what a small town needed to become a real city. He built a sawmill on the Reedy, then an ironworks, a tannery, a brickyard, a stone quarry, 2 grist mills. He opened a cotton factory and a woolen factory, ordering machinery from New Jersey. He donated land for the town's first 4 churches and its first 2 schools. He moved Furman University to Greenville. And in his late 70s, he championed the railroad line connecting Greenville to Columbia, which arrived in December 1853 and changed the town's economy overnight. They called him the father of Greenville, and he earned it. But what made McBee unusual wasn't his ambition. Plenty of Southern planters had ambition. What made him unusual was his insistence on diversification. He didn't want Greenville dependent on any single industry. He wanted mills and quarries and schools and churches and rail all at once. He died in 1864 at the age of 88, just as the Civil War was about to undo most of what he'd built. It would be a decade before Greenville found its next act, and when it did, it found it right where McBee had started, at the Falls. In 1873, 3 businessmen from Boston arrived in town. Oscar Sampson, George Hall, and George Putnam had lost their textile holdings in a catastrophic fire back home and were looking south for a fresh start. South Carolina had the cotton. The Reedy had the water power. Land was cheap and labor was cheaper. They leased property from the McBee heirs, built a mill on the lower falls, and by 1876 had expanded to a second, larger mill on the upper falls. They called it the Camperdown Mill, after the Camperdown elms growing on the property. It was Greenville's first post-war textile operation, and within a few years it was one of the most profitable mills in South Carolina. What happened next happened fast. Northern investors, frustrated by aging machinery and rising wages in New England, looked south and liked what they saw. Rivers for power, cotton in the fields, a workforce willing to work long hours for low pay and almost no unions. The Huguenot Mill went up in 1882, Greenville's first steam-powered operation, running a massive coreless engine that could keep thread moving at precise speeds without breaking. Then Monaghan Mill, then Poe Mill, then Brandon, then Woodside. One after another, the smokestacks rose along the Reedy and its tributaries. By 1903, Greenville County had 8 cotton mills and a bleachery arranged in what locals called the Textile Crescent, a half-ring of factories all within 3 miles of downtown. Each mill came with its own village, not just housing, a complete society. Company houses rented cheap, company stores that accepted a kind of credit issued as part of the workers' wages, which meant the money flowed from the mill to the worker and back to the mill without ever leaving the system. Company churches for Sunday, company schools for the children, and company baseball teams, because nothing kept a tired workforce's morale up quite like beating the rival mill on Saturday afternoon. The textile baseball leagues became serious affairs. Scouts from professional teams would drive down from the cities to watch the games, looking for talent among men who ran looms all week and played ball on the weekend. And build they did. By 1920, Greenville County had the largest number of textile spindles in the state of South Carolina, which itself had one of the largest textile industries in the nation. 20 mills were operating. The population boomed. In the Jazz Age, commercial activity surged up Main Street from Court Square to College Street, filling the blocks with department stores and movie theaters. The Chamber of Commerce tore down Robert Mills's old courthouse to build a headquarters of its own. Across the square, the century-old Mansion House Hotel, Greenville's first resort, dating to 1824, was leveled to make way for something grander. That something was the Poinsett Hotel, designed by the New York architect William Lee Stoddard and built by the J.E. Serene Company of Greenville for $1.5 million. The Poinsett opened in 1925 as the city's first skyscraper. 12 stories of Beaux-Arts elegance, a marble lobby, ornate ironwork, a gold ballroom that would host proms and weddings and political receptions for the next half-century. They named it for Joel Poinsett, a South Carolina statesman who had served as Secretary of War and who, during his time as ambassador to Mexico, introduced to the United States the red-leafed plant that now bears his name. Amelia Earhart stayed at the Poinsett. So did Cornelius Vanderbilt and Bobby Kennedy. The hotel sat at the corner of South Main and West Court, looking down the length of Main Street toward the river, and for a generation it was the finest address between Charlotte and Atlanta. It was on one of those mill teams that a 6-year-old boy named Joseph Jefferson Jackson started working at Brandon Mill, and by the time he was 13, in 1901, was playing baseball on the men's team. He had never been to school. He would never learn to read. But he could hit a baseball in a way that made grown men stop what they were doing and watch. The story goes that he once played a game in stockinged feet because his new cleats gave him blisters. A sports writer noticed and wrote Shoeless Joe in his notebook, and the name stuck for the rest of history. Jackson left the mills for the major leagues and compiled a career batting average of .356, third highest in baseball history, before the 1919 Black Sox scandal ended it all. He came home to Greenville afterward, ran a liquor store on Pendleton Street, and died in 1951. The field where he first played, behind Brandon Mill, on a patch of flattened dirt where mill workers once cheered for their own, is now an 8-acre county park that bears his name. The mill still stands behind it, converted to loft apartments. That detail, the mill that became apartments, is the whole second half of this story, compressed into a single fact. But we're not there yet. By 1946, Greenville could truthfully advertise itself as the textile capital of the world, and nobody disputed it. The biennial Southern Textile Exposition, which the city had hosted since 1915 in a purpose-built exhibition hall on West Washington Street called Textile Hall, had outgrown the building 9 times over. 9 annexes, additional leased space, and still not enough room for all the machinery vendors who wanted in. The exposition had started in borrowed warehouses. It became one of the largest trade fairs in the American South, the event that filled the Poinsett Hotel every other year and kept Greenville's name in the textile trade press worldwide. The money was extraordinary. Greenville was the second richest city in South Carolina by 1920, though only third in population. The first national bank in South Carolina, the National Bank of Greenville, had opened in the city as early as 1872. One local entrepreneur, Bennet Gear, built a textile empire that spanned multiple mills, partly on the strength of a friendship with the New York tobacco magnate James Buchanan Duke. Duke had supposedly kept Gear waiting for 3 days before agreeing to see him. When he finally asked how a Shakespeare scholar could possibly run a cotton mill, Gear replied, "I keep my mouth shut and my eyes and ears open." Gear's mills were among the first to work with rayon and synthetic fibers, pushing the industry beyond simple cotton. But here is the number that should make your stomach tighten. Nearly all of that wealth came from one industry. The entire economy, the tax base, the payroll, the retail, the housing stock, the banks, rested on cotton thread. McBee's ghost, if it had any opinions, might have noticed the irony. The first cracks had appeared as early as the 1920s, when mill owners began stretching out their workers. More production from fewer hands, longer hours, lower pay. The Depression hit Greenville hard in 1929. Mills laid off thousands. Tent cities appeared. The New Deal kept the city alive. Then World War II arrived, and with it, the Greenville Army Air Base, built in 1942 on 2,600 acres south of town at a cost of $7.5 million, with a monthly payroll of $250,000. The base brought thousands of airmen, and it brought something else, the man who built it. Charles E. Daniel was the president of Daniel Construction, an Anderson firm that won the contract for much of the base. He moved his company headquarters to Greenville during the war and stayed. Daniel was a builder by temperament, blunt, tireless, obsessed with growth. After 1945, as textiles continued to expand but cracks kept forming, Daniel began planning for what he called a diversified economy. He pushed for the conversion of the decommissioned air base into an industrial park, a move that, decades later, would provide Michelin's first headquarters site. He convinced the state to open South Carolina's first technical education center in Greenville in 1962, understanding that the new economy would need workers trained in something more than running looms. He and Roger Milliken of Spartanburg spearheaded the creation of the Greenville-Spartanburg International Airport the same year, because a city that wanted foreign investment needed a runway that could handle it. He challenged the city to revitalize Main Street, and just before his death in September 1964, he broke ground on the Daniel Building, 25 stories of white Georgia marble and precast concrete, $8 million, the tallest building in Greenville and in all of South Carolina. He died 2.5 months after the groundbreaking. He never saw a single floor completed. The building opened on July 1st, 1967, 305 feet tall, with parking for 700 cars. Daniel is buried across the street in Springwood Cemetery, facing his tower. But while Daniel was building, the textile industry was dying. Globalization did to Greenville's mills exactly what it would later do to Detroit's auto plants and Pittsburgh's steel works. Cheaper labor in Asia and South America undercut Southern cotton, and one by one the smokestacks went cold. Brandon Mill closed in 1977, one of the first major casualties. By the late 1970s, Spartanburg County alone had lost 25,000 textile jobs. The Poinsett Hotel, once the crown of Main Street, went dark. The last guests checked out, the ballroom emptied, and the building sat vacant, slowly rotting from the inside. The West End neighborhood around the falls, already blighted by the Camperdown Bridge overhead, became, as one historian put it, a place you drove through, nothing but derelicts and dilapidated buildings. This is the moment when, in most American cities, the story becomes a long, slow decline. The jobs leave, the buildings empty, the population drops, someone writes an elegy, and decades later a journalist visits to photograph the ruins. Downtown Greenville in the early 1980s looked like a candidate for exactly that narrative. A local professor named Robert Underwood, who arrived around that time, later recalled that it wasn't a safe place. Storefronts sat vacant. The Reedy River ran strange colors from residual textile discharge. The old Textile Hall, which had once hosted the biggest trade fair in the South, was struggling to find tenants. The Poinsett Hotel was closed, its ballrooms gathering dust. If you had driven through Greenville in 1982, and someone told you that within 40 years it would be one of the most desirable small cities in America, you would have laughed. Greenville did not do what those other cities did. What happened instead is one of the strangest and most deliberate urban turnarounds in the country. And it began with a letter written in broken English from Vienna, Austria, to a young woman on Mills Avenue. In the summer of 1937, a 19-year-old Viennese business student named Max Heller went out dancing and met 5 young American women on a European tour. He danced with one of them, Mary Mills from Greenville, South Carolina, and she gave him her address before she left. Less than a year later, Hitler annexed Austria. Max's family lost their business. He was forced to his knees in the street and made to scrub gutters, while his former schoolmates watched in Nazi uniforms. He needed to get out. He bought a German-English dictionary and wrote to Mary Mills. The letter said, in halting English, "I must get out of here. Please help me. I hope you remember me." Mary Mills took the letter to Shepard Saltzman, the owner of the Piedmont Shirt Company and one of the few Jews in Greenville. Saltzman's response became a kind of legend in the community. "If you, a Christian, are asking me to help a Jew, how can I refuse?" He offered Max a job as a stockboy. On the strength of that offer, the Mills family sponsored his visa, and in August 1938, Max Heller arrived in Greenville, South Carolina. His sister came with him. His parents followed. His fiancée, Trudy Schontal, escaped Vienna separately, crawling through a train tunnel, evading a soldier who pressed a gun to her ribs, and reached New York in 1940 by way of Belgium. They married on Main Street in Greenville in 1942. Between them, they had lost 90 members of their family in the Holocaust. Max rose from stockboy to vice president of the Piedmont Shirt Company, then founded his own firm, the Michelin Shirt Company. He sold it in 1962, a deliberate choice, he said, because he'd seen too many men get hung up on money, and devoted himself full-time to public life. He won a seat on the Greenville City Council in 1969 and was elected mayor in 1971. When people asked him whether it was hard to leave Vienna for a small southern town, he always gave the same answer: "The only thing I miss is the music." And then he set about turning Main Street into something that might remind him of home. Max Heller's vision for downtown Greenville was, for the mid-1970s South, almost radical. He wanted to take Main Street from 4 lanes to 2. He wanted to plant trees, big ones, with canopies. He wanted wide sidewalks suitable for outdoor dining, angled parking instead of parallel, streetlights, landscaping, a European downtown in the South Carolina Piedmont. He fought for it against the prevailing wisdom of the era, which held that cars were sacred and lanes were life. His government formed public-private partnerships, matched federal redevelopment funding, and in 1978 the project was built. Main Street narrowed. The trees went in, young, thin saplings that looked a little foolish at first. The sidewalks widened. For a while, it didn't seem to work. Through the early 1980s, Main Street still felt empty. The textile economy was collapsing. People were shopping at suburban malls like McAllister Square, which had opened on the outskirts of town, and siphoned retail away from the core the way suburban malls did to downtowns across the whole country. Storefront after storefront sat vacant. An early 1980s photograph of Main Street shows the new trees, still thin, still young, barely casting any shade, and almost no one walking beneath them. But the bones of Heller's plan were there, waiting. The sidewalks were wide enough, the lanes were narrow enough. The angle-parked cars created a buffer between the pedestrian and the road. The infrastructure for a walkable city existed. It just needed people. After Heller left office in 1979, he lost a close race for Congress, undone in part, it was widely believed, by anti-Semitic attacks. He was appointed chairman of the South Carolina State Development Board by Governor Richard Riley. It was a role that suited him, part diplomat, part salesman, a man who had escaped one continent and understood what it took to persuade businesses from another continent to take a chance on South Carolina. He worked alongside Charles Daniels Legacy and Governor Fritz Hollings and State Economic Development Coordinator Francis Hipp, all of them making the same pitch to northern and foreign companies. The workforce is here. The land is cheap. The unions are scarce, and we will make it worth your while. One of the companies they helped lure was a French tire manufacturer called Michelin. In 1975, Michelin had opened its first American manufacturing plant in southern Greenville County, the first facility in South Carolina to produce a finished tire. The location wasn't accidental. Michelin's leadership saw that Greenville's textile workforce was skilled, disciplined, accustomed to factory life, and available in large numbers because the mills were closing. As Pete Selleck, a later president of Michelin North America, put it, a lot of our first-generation employees at Michelin in the upstate came from the textile industry, and because they were successful, that really laid the groundwork for all the future investments. By the end of 1984, the Greenville plant alone had produced 40 million tires. In 1985, Michelin moved its entire North American headquarters from Lake Success, New York, to Greenville. The French had arrived to replace the cotton mills. Then in 1992, the Germans came. There were 40,000 unemployed workers in Spartanburg County that year. 25,000 of them had lost textile jobs. Per capita income was under $17,000 a year. The county government was broke. A newly elected county councilman named David Britt had run on a platform of economic development and job creation because there was literally nothing else to run on. When word leaked that BMW was considering South Carolina for its first manufacturing facility outside of Germany, Britt understood the magnitude instantly. He said later that it was a big bet with a huge potential payoff. BMW announced the decision in June 1992. The initial investment, $600 million, 2,000 jobs. The site selection had come down to South Carolina and Nebraska, and Governor Carroll Campbell's team had assembled a $35 million incentive package to close the deal. Few locals had even heard of BMW. One of the first employees hired, a senior engineer named Russell Roman, told reporters years later that when the announcement came, it was a blip on the radar. Nobody could have guessed what it would become. Plant Spartanburg opened on June 6, 1994. Since then, BMW has invested nearly $16 billion in the upstate. The plant has been expanded 7 times. It is now BMW's largest facility in the world, more than 10 million square feet, employing 11,000 workers and producing vehicles exported to 120 markets. Its annual economic impact on South Carolina is $26.7 billion. More than 500 South Carolina suppliers serve the plant, 90% of them in the upstate. For every 10 jobs created at the plant, another 25 are created elsewhere in the state. But it was Michelin that mattered first, because Michelin proved to BMW that Greenville could support advanced manufacturing. Without the French, the Germans might never have come, and without both, the 254 manufacturing plants that were operating in Greenville by the mid-1950s might have dwindled to nothing. While the factories were transforming the economy outside downtown, a quieter revolution was happening inside it. In 1986, 3 branches of Greenville's Peace family donated $10 million toward building a performing arts center on Main Street. Public-private fundraising brought the total to $34 million. The Peace Center opened on November 30th, 1990, with a concert hall, a theater, and an amphitheater on the banks of the Reedy River. Its importance to downtown's revival cannot be overstated. It brought Broadway tours, symphony concerts, ballet, jazz, the kind of cultural anchor that gives people a reason to come downtown after 5 o'clock. Next door, Carolina First Bank built a major new headquarters on Main Street, bringing office workers back to the core. The trees Max Heller had planted a decade earlier were finally growing into their canopy. And then someone started talking about the bridge. The Camperdown Way Bridge had sat over the fall since 1960, carrying 5,600 vehicles a day. Not a particularly heavy load, but enough to justify its existence on paper. Beneath it, the neighborhood was a wasteland. The river still ran odd colors. The falls were invisible. A 1990 traffic study projected that removing the bridge would cost motorists $3 million a year in longer commutes. There were people who called it a perfectly good bridge, and by engineering standards, they were right. But a garden club had been quietly working on the land around the bridge for almost 2 decades. In 1967, the Carolina Foothills Garden Club, under the leadership of a woman named Harriet Weich, had obtained 26 acres of former mill property along the Reedy, including 6 acres donated by Furman University, and begun the slow, patient work of turning derelict industrial land into something resembling a park. They planted, they cleared, they waited. By the late 1990s, Mayor Knox White had taken up their cause. White understood that Greenville needed what he called a story, something beyond tearing down a bridge, something that looked ahead. He found it in the Garden Club's decades-old vision, a pedestrian bridge over the falls, a world-class park at the heart of downtown, a reversal of the decision the city had made in 1960 to hide its birthplace under a highway. The arguments were furious. Critics said the city was destroying a road to build a park. They said traffic would worsen, development in the West End would stall, and anyway, the whole thing was a waste of money. Multiple master plans from the 1980s had called for the bridge's removal, but every time the idea gained traction, practical objections killed it. The bridge was structurally sound. It carried traffic. It was paid for with federal highway money, which meant removing it required permission from the Federal Highway Administration and the South Carolina Department of Transportation. White's administration commissioned a transportation study, worked the bureaucracy, and built a coalition of local developers, community newspapers, and garden club members, an unlikely alliance of business interests and azalea enthusiasts. In 2002, the City Council voted to acquire the Camperdown Bridge and demolish it immediately. When the bridge came down, sunlight hit the falls for the first time in 42 years. People stood on the banks and stared. Many of them had lived in Greenville their entire lives and never seen the waterfall. A historical marker placed at the site later would note that in those 4 decades, residents had lost even the memory of the falls. 2 years later, in September 2004, the Liberty Bridge opened, a 345-foot pedestrian suspension span designed by the Spanish engineer Miguel Rosales, curved away from the falls so that walkers looked directly into the cascading water. The bridge is supported by twin incline towers and a single suspension cable with thin suspender cables only on the side away from the falls, leaving the view completely unobstructed. There is nothing else like it in the Western Hemisphere. The bridge cost the city less than the Camperdown Bridge's annual traffic study had predicted in lost commuting time. Falls Park on the Reedy, 32 acres of terraced gardens, stone paths, and river views, became almost overnight one of the top-rated urban parks in the United States. TripAdvisor would rank it alongside Central Park and Golden Gate Park, and around it, the city began to transform at a pace that startled even its boosters. The Poinsett Hotel, which had sat empty and deteriorating for years, was purchased in November 1997 by developers Steve Dopp and Greg Lennox, who had already restored the Francis Marion Hotel in Charleston. They spent $20 million stripping the building to its bones and restoring the original ironwork, the chandeliers, the tile work, the gold ballroom. On October 22, 2000, the Westin Poinsett reopened, 75 years after its first grand opening, and reclaimed its place as the finest hotel between Charlotte and Atlanta. In 2025, it celebrated its centennial, still anchoring the corner of South Main and West Court, looking down the street toward the falls that are, once again, visible. Main Street filled in. Over 200 restaurants opened downtown. Shops, galleries, breweries moved into the old storefronts and into the old mills. The Brandon Mill, where shoeless Joe Jackson had started working at 6 years old, became loft apartments. The Huguenot Mill became offices. 9 of the 13 surviving textile mills in Greenville County have been converted to new uses. The smokestacks still stand. They just mean something different now. A 28-mile pedestrian and bike trail called the Swamp Rabbit Trail stitched the city together, running through parks, past cafes, along the river. In 2006, the Greenville Drive, a minor league baseball team, moved into Fluor Field in the West End, a stadium deliberately built without its own parking lot, designed to force fans to walk through downtown, past the restaurants and the shops and the falls. Average attendance? 5,000 a game. It was the kind of decision that would have seemed insane in 1985 and seemed obvious by 2010. The numbers tell the rest. Greenville County's population was 452,688 in 2010. By 2026, it was approaching 592,000, a 31% increase in 16 years, making it the largest county in South Carolina. Between 2022 and 2023, the city of Greenville was named the fastest-growing city in the United States by the Census Bureau, with a growth rate of 1.7%. The median household income hit $71,000. Michelin alone employs nearly 10,000 workers in South Carolina and generates $8.2 billion in annual economic impact for the state. The cumulative total economic impact since 1975, $266 billion. The people moving to Greenville are coming from everywhere. Retirees from the Northeast attracted by lower taxes and mild winters. Young professionals drawn by the cost of living, 4.5% below the national average. Families who want walkability and good schools without the price tag of a coastal city. Michelin employees transferred from France. BMW engineers whose fathers worked in Spartanburg before them. Between 2024 and 2025 alone, roughly 5,600 more people moved into Greenville County from elsewhere in the United States than moved out. Between 2022 and 2023, the county gained 14,000 residents in a single year, the largest annual increase in its history. They arrive and find something that most American cities threw away decades ago, a real downtown with a real Main Street, where you can walk from a 100-year-old hotel to a waterfall in 5 minutes. They find more than 200 restaurants in downtown alone, enough to earn James Beard Foundation nominations and Michelin recognition, enough to fill a Friday night in July with a 2-hour wait at restaurants with names like Sobeys and Gianna and Passerelle Bistro, which sits right on the Liberty Bridge. They find a performing arts campus that books Broadway tours and symphony seasons. They find a ballpark in the West End where you can watch a game and then walk to Falls Park in the summer twilight. They find a 28-mile trail where you can bike from downtown to the town of Travelers Rest without touching a road. And they find, underlying all of it, a stubborn architectural continuity. The old mill buildings haven't been torn down. They've been turned into something new. The smokestacks remain. The brick remains. The history is visible. But what makes the Greenville story different from every other urban revival pitch in America is how it happened. It wasn't a single visionary or a single investment. It was a chain of counterintuitive decisions, each one building on the last, stretching across 50 years. A Holocaust refugee who narrowed a highway, a garden club that adopted a wasteland, a French tire company that hired textile workers, a city council that demolished a perfectly good bridge, a developer who bet $20 million on a dead hotel. Each decision looked risky or foolish at the time. Each one turned out to be right, and each one depended on the ones before it. Michelin couldn't have come without the textile workforce. The Peace Center couldn't have worked without Heller's sidewalks. The Liberty Bridge couldn't have been built without the Garden Club's 20 years of quiet groundwork. There is a phrase that Knox White, who served as mayor for more than 2 decades, liked to use. He called Greenville a 50-year overnight success story. The people who visit now see the finished product, the gleaming bridge, the packed restaurants, the award-winning park, and assume it must have always been this way, or that it happened quickly. It didn't. It happened one decision at a time over 2 generations, each one a bet placed on an idea that most sensible people rejected. Max Heller died on June 13, 2011, at the age of 92. His obituary in the Greenville News described him as a visionary, a humanitarian, and the father of modern Greenville. In the 1980s, when the trees he'd planted on Main Street were still saplings, and the storefronts were still empty, and the Poinsett was still dark, people would walk past his work and see nothing. Just a too narrow road with 2 small trees in a downtown that had lost its purpose. Today, those trees form a canopy so thick that Main Street feels like a cathedral nave, the light filtering green through the leaves. More than 120 restaurants line those 10 blocks. On a Friday evening, the sidewalks that Max Heller widened to accommodate cafe tables are so crowded you can barely get through. He always said the only thing he missed about Vienna was the music. He spent the rest of his life making sure Greenville had everything else. The Reedy River still runs through the middle of town. The falls still drop 40 feet over the ancient rock. On a summer evening, the Liberty Bridge fills with people leaning against the railing, looking down at the water. And not one of them has any idea that for 42 years there was a highway where they are standing, that the thing they came to see was buried under concrete, hidden so completely that an entire generation grew up without knowing it was there. The stone retaining walls of the old Camperdown Mill are still visible above the falls if you know where to look. The ruins of Richard Pyrrhus's grist mill, built in 1776, are still there too, down among the rocks. 250 years of industry, ambition, failure, and reinvention, all within a few hundred yards of moving water. The waterfall hasn't changed. Greenville just finally stopped pretending it wasn't there.